Hello and good morning and good afternoon from coast to coast, members of the Canadian Home Builders Association. My name is, of course, Kevin Lee. I'm the CEO of our national organization, and I'm extremely pleased to be joined today from his hometown in Quebec City, the Honourable Jean-Yves Duclos, Minister for Families, Children and Social Development. Thank you so much for joining us today, Minister.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kevin, for arranging this important meeting with your team and my team. I'm delighted to be here in the virtual presence of your tremendous membership.
Well, and we've had a chance to talk many times, you and I, be it recently we appeared together on the 6th Estate. We often are meeting around the employers commissioner table for employment insurance. You've taken time to also address our members at things like Day on the Hill, and we really appreciate the engagement you've had. And for our members who maybe aren't familiar with your title as Minister for Families and Children and Social Development, I should also add, of course, very importantly for our membership, you're also the minister responsible for CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So obviously much of what we'll talk about today revolves around that housing element of your mandate. And so we do have you for an hour, so we appreciate you taking the time for that. And we'll get a chance to talk about all the things that are affecting our industry, what's affecting home buyers and homeowners, talk about the new incentive program your government has asked. Obviously, affordability is always key for us, so we'll want to talk about mortgage rules and supply and all of that, and a whole bunch more. We have a bunch of questions, obviously, ready to go from our side, from our national office, as well as we in promoting and advertising this initiative to our members, we also had them sending questions, so we've been able to incorporate those. I have them here in my handy dandy cue cards. And to those of you watching today, we would encourage you also to send in questions. There is a question function on your go-to webinar console, so please feel free to dial in questions, and our staff will be bringing them over to me. We might hold off on some because we do have a bit of an order for things, but we will encourage you to send in those questions as we go. So with that, I think that sets the table, and perhaps, Minister, now I can pass it over to you to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Kevin. And may I start by commending and thanking you for your leadership, not only your leadership, Kevin, of course, but the leadership of the association and the leadership of home builders across Canada in general, because your level of advocacy, your ability to support the government in making the type of decisions that are deemed to be important by you and your colleagues, that ability to advise and to guide has been tremendously important in the last 4 years. And the type of results that you're seeing is in large part explained by in the type of strong advocacy that you've been able to make. Of course, your association and your members, home builders across Canada, contribute to economic and social development in many, many different ways. You are supporting families and communities at different stages of their lives. You are not only constructing homes, but also constructing lives and building people's livelihood, as you provide jobs and opportunities for thousands and hundreds of thousands of Canadians across Canada. And you're also leading to what I call more livable places, or places where people, as I said, can feel comfortable and can develop their full potential. Now, that's so important in the current context of our economy in our society, when Canada and Canadians are feeling all sorts of affordability pressures, which lead to all sorts of anxieties as well. And these anxieties and these affordability pressures limit the abilities of families and workers in investing in themselves and in their communities. So when you build homes, as I said, you build lives, and you encourage people to think about their future and the future of those they love. So that's, broadly speaking, the type of significant and unfortunately perhaps sometimes too little understood impact that you have as home builders. So thank you so much. Now, we've in the last 3 to 4 years, we've done quite a lot in encouraging a level of housing investments that would be of sufficient importance to live up to the economic growth that we've seen. So, and as I said, there are challenges in many places. I was in Vancouver just yesterday. I was in Victoria the day before. I was in Calgary yesterday, and everywhere in Canada, families and communities are talking about affordability and housing affordability. So in the last 3 years, we put into place a number of measures to deal with both with the affordability and the stability of the housing markets. And in the last budget, March 2019, we introduced two significant measures. I'll summarize briefly the first one and the second one as well, and then turn to questions for more details on those two measures. The first measure was greater flexibility for the home buyers plan. And again, you had advocated for that yourselves, making the home buyers plan more in tune with the modern realities of families, by increasing the level of funding that people can use from their RRSP to buy their first-time home. The level now is $35,000, and B, by making it possible for families that had to split up to start a new life with a new partner, a new family, and still be able to benefit from their RRSP if they have to buy a new home to start a new life. That's the first thing that was in March, the March budget. The second thing, of course, was this introduction of the first-time home buyers incentive. That's something which the Canadian government had never done before. So it's totally new. It's a different tool that CMHC had never used. In fact, that tool, the shared equity tool, really doesn't exist anywhere else in the world apart from Australia, where a limited form of it exists. So it's something that we're starting and which we believe to be of significant value to support your own work as home builders. So I would therefore be very happy to go in more details, but I would perhaps stop now and listen to your members, Kevin, and see what aspects of the first-time home buyers incentive they would like to know more about, or other aspects of the broader housing conversation and housing set of actions that we absolutely need to have in Canada at this point in our development.
Perfect. Well, thank you. That's a great intro, and yeah, absolutely right on the home buyers plan. The ability for homeowners to pull more, save more, and then pull more out of their RSP to get that first home purchase is really important. And adjusting for changes in household formation and that major life changes was also something that we had talked about. So it was great to see that all coming forward. Now, on your incentive program and the shared equity mortgage side, of course, that's also something that CHBA has, been working on. We studied all kinds of different ways to help people into home ownership and found that was very successful. We've had members in Ontario and Saskatchewan and elsewhere that have engaged in sort of more local programs. Now, of course, from our perspective, we were very much looking at it as helping people out of sort of housing assistance, or people who are just on the cusp and only able to make rent, but probably given their circumstances might never be able to become homeowners. So it was more of a hand up program out of some form of assisted housing. So of course what was introduced in the budget went quite a bit beyond that in trying to be a response to more sort of lower income but still middle class families. So that was quite far beyond what even honestly what we expected from CHBA as an approach. We were more looking at it as that hand up type of thing. But I guess one of the questions that we've gotten a lot from our members is there seems to be conflicting numbers coming out of different government officials as to how many this is going to help. Initially it was this is going to help 100,000 people become homeowners, but then we're also hearing from CMHC that no, it's going to only help a smaller number. It's not going to affect markets. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, because our members have been asking, what's the expected market penetration of this particular program and incentive?
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. And three broad things in reaction to your question. The first thing is that you said this is a targeted program. So it's targeted to those middle-class families, and typically younger middle-class families, that really in many parts of Canada really find it difficult to believe that one day they will achieve their dream of owning a first-time home. So it's true in places, as I mentioned, in Vancouver and Victoria, but also in Calgary and Toronto and many other places in Canada. And that is a serious source of anxiety for those middle-class and younger families, because it makes them feel dubious as to their ability to stay where they are, which is typically where they like to live and where they like to grow their family. So it's tremendously important to target that help to those families. The second thing is that it's an entirely new program, and that's why CMHC has an estimate of 100,000 families that would benefit from that over the next 3 years, but it's an estimate based on the type of families we want to assist and the housing market condition that we observe across Canada. And it may well be an overestimate or an underestimate. We really are not certain, again, because it's a very innovative way of helping middle class and younger middle class families. The third thing is that we will be monitoring very closely the outcome of that program, and we'll be, of course, relying on your guidance to provide us with feedback on how you see this operate on the ground. So you'll, in your role as housing leaders across Canada, you'll see really well how it operates, how it works. You'll be in contact with families, with communities, and therefore we'll be relying on your help to adjust, if at all necessary and useful, the parameters of the program, so to make sure that it has the type of impact that we believe is important for families and communities.
Super, and yeah, we do appreciate the fact that we have been going through some consultations with your staff at CMHC to cover potential areas of confusion or how the program could be improved. And one of the things, I'm going to ask you this question. In our last conversation, I know that the answer hadn't been landed on yet, so it's a bit of an unfair question, but maybe you have some insights to this point. Because one of the challenges of this, because with a shared equity mortgage, of course, with 5% for existing homes and 10% for new construction, which that is a good thing, encouraging new construction, but of course we can expect that there might be major renovations to those homes over time, which would add to the value, and how that gets dealt with in a shared equity mortgage program can be complicated. Have you any insights yet, or are we still waiting to see how that will be dealt with in the coming weeks?
So the current situation is that the value of what needs to be reimbursed will be based on the proportional increase or non-increase of the property over time. And as you might recall, the rebate provided by CMHC must be repaid in either of three ways: either after 25 years of the incentive having been received, when the property is sold, or any time at the choice of the family with no penalty whatsoever. Now, first-time home buyers are special. They don't typically buy the average house in a market. They buy a starter home, and they also typically resell their home more quickly than the average home owner. So we expect that the issue of renovation will not be of as critical importance as you would find with the average home owner. And that's why the current parameters now are such that the increase in the value of the house would take into account the increase in the total value of the house. Now, two things can happen. Either the family sells the house before significant renovations are being made to the house, the first-time house, in which case, of course, that wouldn't be an issue. Or the family, they might consider renovating significantly, enhancing its his or her or their property, in which case they would probably, given the parameters of the program, want to reimburse CMHC before they proceed to renovations that would lead to a very significant change in the value of the house. That would make sense, because if you're about to renovate the house, it's probably because you've accumulated significant equity in your home and therefore are able to repay the incentive provided by CMHC at the very start.
Right, great. Okay, so we actually have a question in pertinent to what's going on. This will be, I think, an easy one for you, but How is borrowing money for a down payment through the incentive program better or different than being able to qualify for a mortgage on your own as a first-time buyer?
That's a very good question. So the idea here is to make it less risky and less costly for a first-time home buyer to buy that first-time home, and therefore the shared equity mortgage, which is the technical way to describe the first-time home buyer's incentive, what it does is to reduce the cost of a mortgage, but not increase the value of the down payment. Because in most cases, that's what is a problem for younger families. They don't want to pay high mortgage costs, but they don't have a lot of down payment to put in. So that limits their ability to buy their first time home. So this incentive, what it does is to keep the down payment at a level which can be provided for by the family, while keeping the mortgage costs lower. So just to give you an example, the incentive can be applied to a home up to approximately $500,000, a bit more, but approximately. Let's use that example. So a family buying a first-time home of $500,000 would need a lower down payment, but still be able to decrease its mortgage monthly cost by up to $300 per month. So it's $300 less in monthly mortgage costs that the family would need to pay without having to pay a larger down payment. That make a difference. That often will make a difference in the decision of that family to buy the home. And if the family does decide to buy a home, then there will be more money left for other expenses than the mortgage costs.
Right. And so you were talking a little bit about risk and that and making it less risky. And another question that we've gotten from all different parts of the country is sort of the explanation and maybe a discrepancy that needs to be clarified, because we know, as you know, we've been advocating for 30-year mortgages for first-time buyers to do similar things to what the incentive program is doing, but without having to have a full-blown program. In fact, the two would go hand in hand very well. But one of the reasons that the government was sort of moving away from 30-year AMs down to 25, and that was to get that sort of risk off the taxpayer books, if you will, because the market can be risky, and we didn't want to. The thought was from government not to expose the Canadian taxpayer to the risks of the housing market more than necessary. Yet, obviously, by investing in a shared equity program, you're not just talking about mortgage insurance, but right in there investing in the housing market directly. So can you just talk a little bit about the rationale and the differences between those types of risks in the housing market and CMHC's involvement in it?
Very good. So there is the what we call the macro risk, the systemic risk that the economy incurs when housing markets change. There is the individual risk that families incur when they buy a home, and that risk is often seen as very significant for first-time home buyers. And then there is a risk that CMHC incurs when it creates those types of programs. So at the macro level, at the systemic level, like across the Canadian economy, the housing market risk is addressed by what we call macro-prudential rules, including the stress tests and all the other measures that members of the association would know about. So that's about the stability of the housing market, and it's very important to be mindful of those types of risks, because as we all know, most households invest most of their savings through their homes. So the majority of household savings in Canada is invested in owning a home, and we want to protect families and households from the risk of losing the value of that equity. Now, at the individual level, family level, as I said, that perceived risk of buying a first-time home is particularly magnified for younger middle-class families because of the changing labor market situation, the changing family situation. Families are less stable than they used to be. Wages, or as I mentioned, are not always of great value for younger workers. The wage scale is, of course, so that younger families, younger workers have a lower wage and more precarious jobs. So it all complicates the lives of middle-class families in markets like big cities where many of these families would like to live and grow and work. So the incentive has this benefit of decreasing the risk that these families take that when they buy their first time home because of the shared equity feature of the incentive. And finally, for CMHC, well, CMHC is a big organization and a very strong organization as well. And so its ability to manage risk both at the individual and the macro level is very significant, and we'll of course monitor that as we proceed. But I wouldn't be too concerned about the government's and CMHC's risk in that venture. I think it's well managed and well understood. I would be more mindful of the potential benefits for families and for home builders of that type of incentive.
Okay, great. Another question for you, more specific on the logistics, and the question is: can home buyers repay at any time, or is there any kind of penalty for paying back early on the incentive program?
So home owners can repay the incentive in 3 different timelines. First, they will need to repay the incentive when they sell their home, or they will need to repay the incentive no later than 25 years after they receive the incentive, or they can pay back the incentive anytime they choose. And if they do so, there is absolutely no penalty to doing that.
Okay, perfect. All right, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just reading the question here because you're not going to like what this means. But could the incentive program be changed or removed based on federal political party change?
Well, we live in a democracy, and democracies are there to change policies if those policies are deemed to be not good. So that's the prerogative of future governments to do that if they so want to do so. This being said, we are, as I said at the start, living in an environment, in a society where affordability pressures are very significant, and you feel them whenever you travel to larger cities, in particular in Canada. So addressing these affordability pressures for middle-class Canadians is key if we want middle-class Canadians to keep growing and to keep investing in our economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly from an association's perspective here at CHBA, as I mentioned off the top, I mean, we see this type of program as being very beneficial, especially for those who wouldn't be able to qualify otherwise, and as that hand up for those who would maybe never get into home ownership otherwise. As we sort of segue into, you mentioned stress tests, so we're going to start to get there, because of course that's been a huge issue for our membership. But one of the things that, you know, we of course wonder as an association, and our membership wonders, is why go to this type of program for sort of a more average middle class, even if lower middle class, but young families starting out needing a program like this, rather than make some tweaks to something like the stress test to help get the continuum moving again, given the changes that have occurred in the past year or two. So maybe, and you know, of course, from our side of things, the recommendation that we've had on the stress test, now that we're, you know, a year and a half into it and markets have changed, is that it would be time to adjust it, especially to encourage longer term mortgages, because we did see an uptick in shorter term 1-year mortgage terms because you were doing the 2-point stress test on whatever the contracted rate is, and why not encourage people to take a longer mortgage and be at that 5-year or more level, and in so doing, you know, given all the impacts that we've seen in the marketplace, could we dial it back to, you know, 0.75 basis points once we're, you know, at the 5-year or longer, and at 7- and 10-year mortgage, even not have a stress test, because by the time you're coming out of that term, your family income is probably increased. You have much more equity in the house. A lot of those risks have now gone away. So you know, that's been our recommendation, but maybe I can get you to speak in general terms about the stress test. And I know from our members, their curiosity is, what would it take to change the stress test, because we're seeing the job impacts and the inability of people to move up, the inability to buy new houses, etc. We hear about it constantly at the association, and it's a big issue, especially in Atlantic Canada, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the economy was already having a hard time, and construction is usually a part of the solution. And then even in places like Vancouver, where we're seeing a downturn and we're seeing job layoffs in a place where there's still a huge demand for more supply of housing. So I'll pass it over to you. That's a long intro to talk about the stress test.
Thank you, Kevin. And that's a very useful introduction to a very important topic. Let me first remind everyone and acknowledge that those measures and the stress test measures in particular must be reviewed from time to time. And what you said now about the evolution of different housing markets across Canada, the fact that we're finding out that now the overheating, the possible overheating and stability indicators are changing after a while due to all sorts of different pressures. That necessarily calls for the government to review regularly those stress tests and other macroprudential measures. So it's absolutely clear, and everyone must absolutely understand that a responsible federal government will always need to keep up with the evolution of housing markets and review and change if necessary the rules governing those tests and other measures. Now, the second thing is about this double objective that I mentioned at the start, the stability and the affordability of the housing market. So the stability of the market is something we absolutely need to keep in mind. We would all want the house prices, well, not all want, but some would certainly want house prices to keep growing in markets where they own a house. But that's a short-term view, which can lead to long-term negative consequences for that person and others in their community. So to be mindful of the fact that housing risk is a source of housing market risk, is a source of risk that can be detrimental to everyone, including, of course, the home builders association membership and the industry more generally. That's something we always need to be mindful of. And as we do this, and as we are mindful of that risk and the importance of adjusting policies to the evolution of those risks, as I said, we need to be investing in the affordability of housing markets, and that's exactly what the first-time home buyers incentive is doing in a manner which is innovative and which will also certainly demand adjustments as we proceed over time.
Perfect. And I should say, since you were referring back to the incentive program, we have a ton of other questions that have come in on that. And what I'm going to say to the members that are asking, because we do have a lot of other ground to cover as well, there's a lot of details on the program right now already on the CMHC site. We've actually been also forwarding that to the membership, and we'll continue to stay on track of it. So to the members that are asking these more detailed questions, look at the CMHC website. CHBA is also sending out more information. We'll keep everybody up to date as we move forward. And maybe if we get time towards the end of the session, we can come back to some of those questions. But if anybody's wondering why we're not getting to them, it's because we have other things like stress test questions and that sort of thing to cover. And I will say about the stress test, our members are also, when prices were escalating too fast, our members in those regions were very concerned as well, because our members get exposed to that kind of thing too. But obviously a lot has changed in the interim, and now we're seeing all of the changes that have compounded one on top of the other, which is why we're suggesting that tweaking is necessary. So we're happy to hear that that the government will at least continue to look at this, because we do think it's time. I will say that one of the concerns that we've gotten from our members is the idea that's been expressed at times by CMHC that, look, the stress test is working, we're improving affordability because house prices are starting to come down in expensive markets. And I think that our members are suggesting that that's probably a little bit disingenuous, because in those cases, the reason why the house prices are coming down a little bit is actually because we've knocked tens of thousands of potential buyers out of the market. So we've actually taken away affordability. So it is potentially achieving other objectives like stopping the acceleration of house prices and that sort of thing. But it's actually not, in those instances, improving affordability, because the reason the prices are coming down are because people are being told they can't afford to buy them and aren't actually in the market. So I would just like to hear your response to that kind of comment.
So that's where the first-time home buyers incentive can come in. So if one problem is the ability for for families to put in the necessary down payment, and if one issue is for them to be able to incur mortgage costs that they think are not reasonable at their current position in their life cycle, then the first-time home buyers incentive can come in and tell them, well, we know you're concerned about mortgage costs, we know you're concerned about mortgage risk, but here is one way to decrease both those costs and that risk for you as first-time home buyers. So at the same time, yes, you're correct. It may well be that and it certainly is the case that we don't want the home prices to fall quickly or to fall at all, which I think we mostly want home prices, house prices to keep, no, to be relatively stable. No, perfect stability is of course impossible and undesirable in most cases, but for house prices not to accelerate too quickly, as you said, is a good thing, not only for families and communities, but for home builders as well. You know, because if we entered into an era of economic breakdown, or people losing faith in the housing market, that would be a terrible thing for everyone, including home builders.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question in here from Tim in Port Coquitlam, and I'm going to sort of add on to it because it was where I wanted to go next. So this works out well. So he's saying, you know, given the disposable income Canadians are facing, why not use 30-year amortization periods to get them into home ownership? And as their incomes increase, their disposable income increases versus continuing to rent, because we do know that rent continues to go up, whereas mortgages don't necessarily. So I'll use that to piggyback onto, you know, our recommendation that it is time to reintroduce 30-year amortization periods for first-time home buyers looking at entry-level markets. And there has been a lot of talk about how young families are at risk because of the you know, you mentioned some of the risks that they do face, but we also know from Equifax data that young Canadians are actually the lowest risk group, and it's actually sort of middle-aged people tend to be more at risk, or seniors, you know, who are now on fixed income. But young people have a long time, their careers are starting, they have enough for a down payment, you know, lowering their mortgage payments while also having a long time to pay it off. Increasing their salaries over time means when their mortgage comes due, their term comes due, they're probably in better perspective. So we see a lot of opportunity to let the best qualified of the first-time buyers who are currently locked out back into the market by going to 30-year amortization periods. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, we started the webinar, Kevin, by letting your members know how important not only their expertise is, but their level of advocacy must be. So it's a type of commons and input that I personally value very much, and that responsible governments must also take into account. So it's a type of partnership that is absolutely essential, you know, based on input and advice from experts in the field, as you are, and for the government, therefore, to make the best informed decisions on that basis. So, of course, you wouldn't expect me to tell you now that we would do this, or the Minister of Finance would do this, because that's his prerogative. But it's certainly something that the Minister of Finance would also be very glad to hear, in the sense of, you know, people of your caliber being willing and able to provide advice based on what you see in the ground, the type of adjustments, flexible policies that you think would be working better. And this is increasingly important, because again, our society, our economy are changing rapidly. We need our policies to be increasingly flexible, to react to the type of challenges that different types of families, different types of communities, and different types of housing markets are going through.
Right. Yeah, and we did just meet with Minister Morneau not too long ago. So, but if you want to pass along to him that he should make that announcement, that would be just great. Another question, just going back to the stress test quickly, that has come in, and we do get this question a lot from members. It's not something that we've really pushed, because I think we understand where government is at with this. But again, really great if you could respond to this. Can the stress test be regionalized, and have there been considerations given to that, rather than having a single stress test for all across Canada, given that we know we have different market conditions in different regions?
Well, that's a good question, and we've been receiving input on that. we've also been receiving both signals of the potential benefits and the potential pitfalls of doing that, because sometimes the markets differ, but the housing conditions and the housing expectations and the incomes of families may look alike in their particular location. So they might live in different cities with apparently different housing markets, but have the same income and the same expectation of the type of houses they want to build. So there is a possible issue of, let's call that equity, fairness, when you cut Canada into pieces and you say, well, for that piece we do this and for that other piece we don't. So it may well be that it could be worked out in a manner which is both efficient and equitable, but that requires a bit more thought. And again, I would encourage your members, Kevin, to be supportive of that type of thinking. How would we be able to do that? And engage with CMHC officials, engage with, of course, our government's representatives, and provide and help us understand, and therefore provide the type of innovative measures that we would need to put into place to do that regionally differentiated type of housing market rules in Canada. For now, in Canada, unless I miss something, the CMHC's rules, the macroprudential rules, and the first-time home buyers incentives rules, these are all national rules. So we don't have regionally differentiated measures in terms of housing across Canada. But for other programs like the employment insurance program, we do have regionally differentiated measures. So it's not impossible, and can sometimes be good to have such discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from the National Association's perspective, we have looked at it a little bit as well, but I have yet to see a region that would be in favor of not having the stress test changed for their region, because whether you're in Atlantic Canada, or the prairies where the economy has been having a hard time and the stress test is piling on, we're seeing the same problems in Toronto and Vancouver, especially now that everything is compounded. So even from a national perspective, we look at all regions and say, just adjusting this overall to tweak to current conditions would probably remain our recommendation. Although you could see how adjusting the stress test, maybe not even regionally, but based not on specific regions, but based on certain factors in a given region. So it's not about a region, it's about when we assess it to be a certain way, then we adjust the stress test accordingly. Much more complex, but certainly something we can continue to work on with yourselves and finance and others, OSFI as well, of course. Now, of course, here's a question from Newfoundland related to household debt. And this has been another frustration that I think a lot of our membership has expressed on a regular basis, because a lot of the talk around the stress test has been about, debt to income ratios and the 1.7 number and all of this. But I think the big concern that we as an association have over that is we seem to be lumping, financing an asset that is going to grow in value, hopefully just at a reasonable pace over time in terms of a home. So financing your home with a mortgage, which is how basically every business in Canada that's become successful starts, is you ultimately finance your starting point, and it's no different for housing. And we're lumping that in with some pretty bad forms of debt, like credit card debt, and even things like, automobile loans and all these other sort of unsecured things. You can go get an unsecured line of credit in a heartbeat. In fact, even some of our members have figured out, don't buy your car until after you buy your house. Because if you buy your house, they're going to measure all of this stuff. If they buy your car, they're not going to measure anything, and you can qualify. So there's a lot of concern about that lumping of the two different forms of debt together. And basically, it seems a lot of the messaging out of CMHC right now is all debt is bad debt, and there's too much. And so we're going to prevent young Canadians from getting into the housing market because older Canadians have taken on too much debt. So how do we distinguish between those two things and get back to a proper valuation of the benefits of home ownership in Canada?
Well, I think it's a very important conversation. A, you're right. It's important to distinguish those things clearly. And B, it's important to let the younger Canadians, or to reassure younger Canadians about the value of investing in a first-time home. Younger Canadians, younger middle-class Canadians have a fairly complex life these days. Raising children, keeping a job, moving up the income scale, in the precariousness, family structures. And of course the housing market situation. That's not easy for younger middle class families to go through. So assisting them, the type of language that you just mentioned, Kevin, assisting them, seeing the continuing value of investing in a home as a way to build equity, to build assets, as opposed to borrowing debt for other purposes. That's something which your membership is able to do as well. So it's politicians like myself can also can also say those sorts of things, but for credible and expert people like you, reassuring young Canadians around the value of investing in a home, I think is something that is absolutely necessary.
Thanks. Another question, and this from Alberta, it's kind of building on our discussions around the stress test and that, but they're also talking here about the slowdown that has been experienced in Alberta, and I'll extend that to Saskatchewan and Atlantic Canada as well. Still recovering economies from many years now. And the question is, normally residential construction would be part of the solution and part of the recovery model. Construction is typically both the ICI, industrial, commercial. There's often investments in recovering economies, and as well for those that still do have good paying jobs and still own their homes, you want construction to be part of the solution. But right now, a lot of the macroprudential measures are actually preventing housing from being part of the solution in these sort of downturned economies. And just looking for your comments on that.
Well, it's three things. First, that might sound a bit too positive and too optimistic, but that's true. Since 2015, we've seen very significant economic growth, driven in large part by investments by middle-class Canadians. So 1 million new jobs, the lowest unemployment rate since 1976. A typical middle-class family in 2019 now has $2,000 more in their pockets than in 2015. We have a debt relative to the economy which is falling, will soon be at its lowest level in 4 decades, and we have the lowest levels of poverty ever seen in the history of Canada. So things have been good for a large number of Canadians over the last 4 years. The second thing is that things have not been uniformly good for everyone across Canada. Now, there are regions that have struggled more, and we need to be very mindful of that when it comes to putting into place economic and social policy that support economic growth. And third, despite that good economic portrait and good economic story, affordability pressures are very significant across Canada, and housing affordability pressures are also very significant. So when you put all these things together, you end up with an economic portrait of the country which says that if we want to continue investing and buying homes and investing in businesses and in jobs, then we need to continue provide hope for Canadians in their future, and for middle-class Canadians in particular. And the agenda of the government, the present government, is exactly that: is to grow the middle class in order to grow the economy. We know it doesn't provide uniform benefits at the same time across Canada, but we think it's the right thing to do, and that involves, of course, relying on the important investments that home builders make across the country. I think it's a story, it's a message, it's a vision that works on average everywhere, but not at the same rate and the same speed at the same time everywhere across Canada.
Mm-hmm. I've got a couple of questions that have come in here. I'm going to kind of tie them together because, of course, you and I talk quite frequently about the housing continuum and the idea of being able to move people, along that housing continuum. And still, we know for, all of the studies and surveys and our own, consumer polls show that, about 94% of Canadians actually want to own a home. The rate of actual home ownership is falling from near 70 down to below 68 now. But even the renters, we know that 4 in 5 still would like to become homeowners. So when you add all that up, it's 94%. But a lot of what's happening right now would suggest that continuum is not working right now. So this question came in from White Rock, and it was, related to the stress test, and saying this is one of the members' employees who has a starter home, and they're actually looking to sell. But they're having a really hard time selling their home because so many first-time buyers are not qualifying through the different stress tests and that kind of thing. So they're kind of, they can't buy their move-up home even though they can afford, because they can't sell their existing home, which then means the person who wants to buy the home is stuck in rental, which leads to this, our other thing that we talk about a lot, the vast majority of new rental that comes available each year, 80% of it comes from buyers moving out of rental and moving into their first time home. So right now, the systems, that continuum that we like to see moving people along, is kind of stuck right now, causing not only, we've got the affordability problems in purchasing a home, but we've also now got the stress on the rental market because we're not having people move out of them. So can you just sort of speak to that and where we go from here?
Well, the word continuum is a very good word. You're right to insist on the continuum and on the transitions that people want to make and need to make from one part of the continuum to another one. And if I may also add, before moving on to the ownership aspect, that the National Housing Strategy, which we announced just about 2 years ago, insist on the value of constructing more rental homes, more affordable rental homes, in particular in big cities where rental homes are sometimes so expensive, so apartments are sometimes so expensive that it's difficult for people to build their equity and therefore have enough down payments to buy their first time home. So the rental construction financing initiative that your members will be aware of is working really well. It's financially very astute. The CMHC is very good at, I think, at helping your members make use of it. We expect that initiative alone to lead to construction of 43,000 new rental units in the next few years. And of course, home builders across Canada and many of them members of the association will benefit from that. And we are very grateful for their work in making that happen. Now, when it comes to moving from rental homes to home ownership, now it's the issue is unfortunately more complicated than just moving from rental to home. Sometimes, people would prefer either staying in the rental market because of job precariousness and family issues. They don't necessarily want to own a home quickly. They might want to stay in a rental home, as I said, in part again because they want to accumulate equity. And sometimes people owning a home might want to do the reverse. They might want to go back to rental for all sorts of reasons, often associated to family structures. So there are many different moves across the continuum, and the idea to make those moves as affordably sustainable as possible, mindful of the fact that stability is also another issue, another objective, not only accessibility and affordability, but also stability. Now, I understand in here, and I think it's again important for you to be effectively assertive of that. And I hear the stress test, how it's seen on the ground. Individually speaking, the impacts might be untasteful, but collectively, in terms of housing stability, in terms of macro-prudential rules, stability of the market has benefits that go beyond the individual benefits of being able to buy a first-time home or buying a home more quickly. So it's a balance. It's an equilibrium. As I said, it's a balance that needs to take into account both the individual level risk and the systemic level risk of the housing markets.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned the National Housing Strategy, and of course we were involved in those consultations. You know well that we would like the National Housing Strategy to focus more also on the market side of housing as opposed to its major focus, which is on those in core housing need and those most at risk. So we understand where it started. We'd love to see it extended more. I'll leave it at that. We've had that conversation before. And a lot of course, what we talk about is that, that market rate housing side and the affordability. But one thing I wanted to get back to with respect to the National Housing Strategy was the Canada Housing Benefit. And that you announced not this past budget, but the budget before, and its ability to help a lot of Canadians who would otherwise be tied to individual units to instead provide financial assistance and give them a little bit more ability, which is something that we work with other organizations to recommend to the government, and we're very happy to see it taken up. And I was hoping you could just make a few comments on that program.
Well, again, it's a demonstration of your leadership, the leadership of your association, the leadership of individuals and teams like you and yours, Kevin. It's something that is, again, new. No, it's a benefit that will help 300,000 families over time live in the places where they want to live. And sometimes those places are not affordable because of income challenges that may stop at some point, but at the particular point of their lives, they find it difficult to live affordably and safely. So this benefit is going to be flexible. It's also going to help home builders provide the types of homes that those individuals can afford and need. So it's going to be very good to see how both the social and the economic value of that benefit will unfold over time. And again, we will be relying on your guidance, Kevin, and all members of the association. That's going to be a benefit introduced in collaboration with provinces and territories. And as you see the unfolding of that benefit, please get back to us and let us know how you would like it to be improved over time.
Yeah, thank you. And we're getting short on time. Next time we'll book you for at least 2 hours because the questions are pouring in. And we haven't even yet talked about supply, which is obviously another huge part of the equation. And I will say, you know, we were really pleased with this report that came out of CMHC, and I know you were. This was a report for you actually to examine the escalating house prices in large Canadian metropolitan centers that came out probably about a year and a half ago now. But a hugely important piece because it really finally put the right lens on supply and the lack of supply that we have, especially in our large and urban centers, and the big impact that has on house prices because of simple supply and demand. We've talked a few times through this discussion today about the shortage of supply and what that does to both the price of homes for ownership as well as homes for rental. Can you talk a little bit about supply is not directly in the bailiwick of the federal government, but you do have lots of levers that you can use to help encourage better supply in our larger urban centers and anywhere else that's required. Can you speak a little bit to the supply side of things in general, since we won't have time to go into all the details?
Well, that's right. As you said, CMHC and the federal government have an impact on supply. This being said, of course, the actual supply efforts of home builders depend on all sorts of other partners, including naturally cities and municipalities. So all sorts of regulations and policies at the more local and provincial levels have a major impact in your ability to increase the supply. This being said, I would also add, I would also say perhaps at the same time that in a country like Canada, which is a booming country, which attracts large numbers of newcomers, where people want to invest and want to live and to grow and to work, supply of housing has to keep pace with that. So it calls upon the association and the members of the association to keep doing whatever they can to encourage other partners, including the federal government, to put into place policies that will facilitate your work in providing more supply. And I may end with the fact that CMHC now has a more ambitious mandate when it comes to supporting your work on basis of appropriate and reliable information. CMHC now has more resources to give your members more information on the current circumstances of different housing markets in Canada. I've asked CMHC to be more ambitious in the quality of that information and also the ability of CMHC to be in touch with you and to provide a more detailed levels of information that members of your association would find important.
Yeah, and that is critical. And the investment that's been made in recent years, I know there's $40 million allocated to creating more and better data and data collection, both to StatsCan and CMHC, in response to the concept of flying blind a few years ago without that housing data, and we're going to need more and more. So that certainly is appreciated. We're sort of coming to the end of our time. I'm going to give you a sense of why we need to have you back sometime soon, because you won't be able to answer these questions. But, you know, there was, again, with your role as Minister for Employment and Social Development Canada, of course, we didn't even get into the whole job side of the equation, and the importance of promoting skilled trades. You know, in residential construction, we predict we're going to be 130,000 new workers short, and we need to get those people into construction, and there's a lot of competition from other sectors as well, and we've talked about that around the table. So I know that your government did a bunch of work in promoting careers in construction in the past couple of budgets, so we do appreciate that, and I know we could have elaborated and spent a bunch of time on that. Other things, you know, is the government planning on formalizing partnerships with industry? That often happens locally and Intel to improve affordability. I know you guys have plans to do things with some of the Canada lands and that, and so another area that we could talk about as well. This is not directly in your mandate, but of course we're working with Natural Resources Canada as well as the National Research Council on the issues around trying to get to net zero ready, and of course our huge concerns about trying to get there too fast and the impacts that that's going to have on affordability. So we have our own net zero program that is moving forward, but it's a voluntary program as we still help those that want to invest that way, but you know, we're very cautious about putting it into code until it's not going to affect affordability. And we kind of could go on and on. I know there's a bunch more questions that we didn't get to, but we really do appreciate your time as we're coming up on 1 o'clock. Before we end, I do want to throw it back to you, see if you have any final wrap-up comments that you would like to make, Minister.
Well, my wrap-up comments will be very similar to my initial comments. Kevin and members of your association have had a great fortune of working with you over the last 3 and 4 years. I would encourage you to keep being proactive. The federal governments, if they want to put into place quality policies, they need your input, your experts on the ground. You see things that federal officials and government elected officials don't see so quickly and so well. So keep being proactive, keep being the experts that we need you to be. The National Housing Strategy, the first-time home buyers incentive, the investments in rental housing and home ownership, the stress test, the macroprudential rules, all of these things are absolutely essential, not only to you as home builders, but also to our government as a government that wants to keep growing the economy, give everyone a fair chance in life, and having a type of society that benefits everyone.
Perfect. Well, listen, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time, really appreciate your insights. Thank you for the initiatives you've taken already, and thank you for taking into consideration our ongoing recommendations around the stress test, 3-year AMS, you know, all the work we need to do on supply and so much more. We'll look forward to continuing to work with you moving forward. And I know a big thanks from all our membership for taking time today. And like I said, it looks like we'll have to book you for at least 2 hours next time. So we'll have to find a time slot. All right. Thank you very much. Again, that's the Honourable Minister Jean-Yves Duclos joining us from Quebec City to talk about housing affordability and all the things that affect our industry and homeowners. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to talking to you real soon. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Kevin.